My name is Marco, and I'm going to be refuting my atheist friend. My friend Griffin Byrne posted a video titled "The Resurrection is a Myth," and here's how I know. And I'm going to be refuting the claims he makes throughout the video and supporting more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Now, an apologist might say, see how he says most of whom are still living? He's clearly asking the reader to go and seek out these witnesses for himself, to verify it. Why would Paul say this if he was unsure that these 500 witnesses actually exist? Well, this doesn't make much sense. The readers of this letter, the Corinthians, would have been living in southern Greece at the time, and the events Paul is describing, and thus the location of the 500 witnesses, would have been in Judea, or modern-day Israel, all the way down here. At a time when a trip like this would have been a hugely costly, long, and dangerous endeavor, did Paul seriously think that anyone was going to read this and say, oh boy, I better take the next ship right on down to Judea and seek out one of these unnamed 500 peasants that may or may not still be alive to see if they really did see Jesus rise? I don't think so. So it's safe to say that Paul's mention of some of whom are still living is not an indication of how confident he is that these witnesses are real. Instead, it's a lazy effort to make this claim sound more credible, because, oddly, Paul mentions no sources, no contact.
Griffin is correct in his assessment that St. Paul's letter was for the Corinthians, but what he lacks to take into account is that these people were not in need of evidence to believe, but already believed in the resurrection of Jesus. The letter from St. Paul to Corinth was not an apologetic work, but rather a work to correct the behaviors of the Corinthians. There is no reason Paul needs to make his claim look credible if the people he is writing to already believe. It seems to be that Griffin is just grasping for straws here. No source, no contact. What would you expect the source to look like? Griffin keeps moving the goalpost. His criteria that Paul mentions the 500 by name and stating their location. But what Griffin is certainly forgetting is the cost of writing. It's a very expensive process, and there is no reason for Paul to write out every single name just to cite a source.
What happened here is Paul collapsed as he was traveling to the city of Damascus, saw a bright light, and started hearing voices, which is almost a textbook description of an auditory/visual hallucination. That's what Paul is talking about when he says, last of all, he appeared to me. The Greek verb used here, meaning he appeared, is used for all of Jesus' appearances in this letter. So, if appeared can mean just seeing a bright light and hearing voices, does he really mean that 500 people witnessed the risen Jesus? Or does he mean that a bunch of people, potentially a number that he exaggerated, all experienced Jesus in this vague way?
As Griffin states, Paul uses the same Greek verb, appeared, throughout the whole letter. But Griffin tries to manipulate it using Paul's conversion story as the means by which Jesus appeared to the 500. What Griffin glosses over is that we see in the letter he also states appeared to the apostles. And we can see in the Gospels that it's certainly not the same as Paul's conversion, but rather they interacted with the risen Jesus, and it's not just a visual light. We can see that Griffin's being inconsistent here, trying to manipulate it.
But where are the detailed eyewitness accounts of the risen Jesus? Where is the direct testimony of a disciple or a believer saying, yes, I saw Jesus after the crucifixion, that apologists seem to cite so often? Well, it doesn't exist. That's right, there are literally no eyewitness accounts of the resurrection.
Notice how Griffin here gives us no evidence for this claim? He claims that the Gospels are anonymous and not written by eyewitness sources. But the Gospels were written by the apostles, and certainly the apostles were eyewitnesses. Griffin assumes they're anonymous because they don't have their signature or name in them. But what Griffin does not tell you is that this is how ancient literature was written, and it is just a complete straw man of our position. There's an abundant amount of evidence from the early church fathers from all different locations agreeing on who wrote which gospel. It also makes no sense for the people to attribute the Gospels to Mark, Matthew, and Luke, as Mark and Luke were not a part of the 12, and Matthew was a tax collector. If people wanted to make it up, surely they would go with Peter, the head of the disciples, to make their gospel look even more strong, to help support whatever fake illusion or idea they're trying to spread.
Some of the earliest manuscripts do not include verses 16:9 to 20. So here's how the first versions of Mark actually ended. And they were saying to one another, this is Mary and Mary Magdalene, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Seek the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Yeah, that's right. The earliest manuscripts of Mark just end on the two Marys exiting the tomb afraid. There is no description of the risen Jesus.
We see Griffin dismiss, even with the early ending of Mark, that it does still state the resurrection of Jesus. But what Griffin is not taking into account is the St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Skeptics like Griffin assert that this letter came before the Gospels, and St. Paul's letter certainly claims the resurrection of Jesus throughout its whole text.
As for the later Gospels, it's clear that they are not independent accounts which corroborate each other, as apologists would have you believe. Both Matthew and Luke, written 50 and 60 years after Jesus' death respectively, lift entire passages word for word from Mark, and analyses of the three synoptics show that there was a lot of cross-contamination between the texts, which does not line up with the idea that these are independent testimonies.
Griffin tries to discount the reliability of the Gospels, stating they are just copies of Mark, which disregards the abundant amount of evidence present in each Gospel. But it is not crazy to think that the Gospels have overlapping information in words, because the words are quotes from Jesus. It makes sense that they would contain overlap. Each Gospel does present new information that aren't in others. If we look at this Gospel from Peter J. Williams' book, Can We Trust the Gospels, which is a book I recommend to anyone who's watching this video, we can see geographical evidence and evidence in names. Griffin seems to just dismiss all of this information with his simple-minded claim that they contain overlap.
What also doesn't line up is how the Gospels become progressively more divine and miraculous the further away from Jesus' death they are written. As I explained in Mark, the earliest Gospel, there isn't even an account of the risen Jesus. In Matthew and Luke, instead of a man sitting inside the tomb, we now have an angel. And instead of ending with the women running off, afraid, Jesus appears to his disciples, gives a little speech, eats some bread with them, and pieces out. In John, the latest Gospel, there are now not one but two angels inside the tomb, and there's entire mini-narratives that are added, like the story of doubting Thomas, where a disciple touches Jesus' wounds to confirm that he is indeed real. Awfully convenient, isn't it? The dialogue is far lengthier, and not only does Jesus give his disciples bread, he goes fishing with them, has a little feast, tells Simon to tend his sheep, has a much longer speech, and finally he ascends. So why are details being added the further away from Jesus' death we get?
The notion that more detail about the resurrection accounts increase more throughout the time from the resurrection of Jesus, firstly, is just speculation, and also false. Bringing back St. Paul's letters to the Corinthians, if we look at it, skeptics like Griffin, again, consider this to be the first the closest thing written to the resurrection of Jesus. And this shows an abundant amount of evidence of Paul believing in the resurrection.
One thing you'll hear a lot is that, quite simply, the resurrection is the only thing that explains all of these events. The empty tomb, how seemingly convinced the disciples were, and the rapid rise of Christianity. But even if you can put the textual issues behind you, this argument does not hold up. First of all, the rapid rise of Christianity only proves that it was a very appealing worldview, not that it was true. If the rate at which a religion grows proves its legitimacy, then the growth of Islam and the military victories associated with it would make it a much better candidate than Christianity.
I asked Griffin to state what he thinks is appealing about the Christian worldview for the early Christians. Early Christians received no benefits. Rather, they just received persecution from everyone, from Jews to Romans. Christianity didn't spread through military conquest as Islam did. Because of this, their growth rates cannot be compared.
As for the empty tomb, there are a variety of explanations. The body was stolen, the woman went to the wrong tomb, Jesus was put into a mass grave, the list goes on. I agree that some of these explanations may seem implausible, but hold on, you can't play the implausible card if you're arguing for a literal resurrection. So let's take a theory that, just for example, most people agree is a pretty ridiculous one. Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, and when the disciples reported seeing him later, they actually did see them. It's because he survived. Now, the notion that he survived crucifixion, I just want to say, is indeed a ridiculous one. The Romans knew how to kill people, as Christian apologists will point out in response to this. But the idea that a dead guy crawled out of his tomb over the weekend isn't just ridiculous, it contradicts everything we know about how humans work. It feels weird that I even have to say this. So regardless of what the texts say, as long as there is a naturalistic explanation of any kind that doesn't involve someone getting resurrected, then there's no reason to believe the latter.
The problem that Griffin is creating for himself is that nothing could convince him that Jesus really did rise, which is intellectually dishonest. No amount of evidence will ever convince him that Jesus rose from the dead. Griffin states that even the answers that make no sense are more probable than someone dying and coming back 3 days later. This is because Griffin believes it's impossible to do so. And the reason he thinks that this is impossible is because he believes there is no God. He is no longer assuming that there is no God, but is using it to disprove the resurrection claims. If God exists, then the resurrection account's certainly more probable than any other answer. So now it boils down to whether God exists. And if he does exist, then the resurrection is true. Now, I want to leave one last question before I wrap it up. Griffin, and you fellow atheists, what is the probability that God exists? Thank you guys so much for watching. I want to give a thanks to Griffin for uploading that video and giving me the opportunity to refute his ideas and have a intellectual dialogue. I want to forward you guys to the debate we had on his podcast and this video he created. God bless to everyone watching.